Hello and welcome to the World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump is coming back into office at one of the most complicated times in world history, against a backdrop of rapidly emerging technologies that will change the way we live, to global alliances that are redefining a new world order. Two wars are raging, one in the Middle East, the other in Ukraine. This week's World Deciphered focuses on the complicated nature of both of these conflicts and on why the experts say that resolving these wars will come at a cost no matter what. We're talking this week with former National Intelligence Manager for Iran at ODNI, Norm Rule, about what to expect in the Middle East under a new Trump administration. And the Cipher Brief's chief international correspondent, Iya Mermishvili, is talking with the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, John Erbst, about what Ukraine and NATO might expect from Trump 2.0. Let's check in first, though, with Cipher Brief managing editor Tom Nagorski in New York to get a look at the other stories the Cipher Brief is working on this week. Tom?
Hey, Suzanne. Well, we're a long way from Inauguration Day, but Donald Trump is already having a global impact. That's thanks to the people he's named for some key national security positions. In Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing allies have been thrilled not just with Trump's victory, but also by those nominees, all of whom are staunch supporters of Israel and hardliners when it comes to Iran. Then there was the appointment of Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel. Huckabee is an evangelical Christian who not only supports Israeli settlements, he also says the Palestinians have no claim to the West Bank and that Israel holds, quote, the title deed, unquote, to that land. Now, the ambassador isn't a policymaker, of course, but if that ever became Trump administration policy, it would end support for a two-state solution, from Washington at least. And in Ukraine, Trump's victory has made President Zelensky and many others nervous. Those anxieties have only been heightened by the Trump appointments, all of whom have questioned American support for Ukraine and backed Trump's idea for a quick end to the war. As you know, Suzanne, we're already hearing a lot of talk about peace deals that would involve the surrender of Ukrainian land to Russia. Other appointments have drawn attention closer to home. The defense secretary job has traditionally gone either to decorated generals or executives from the private sector. Given that running the Pentagon is a huge management job, Trump's nominee for defense is Pete Hegseth, a Fox News host with lower-level military experience. And the nominee for Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, has been criticized for statements supporting Russia and for a meeting with the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. Supporters of these appointments say the institutions need the disruption that the nominees will bring. And lastly this week, a cautionary tale about social media. Kevin Rudd was a prime minister and foreign minister in Australia. When he left government, he was very open about his feelings for the first Trump administration. He called Donald Trump, quote, the most destructive politician in American history. He drags America and democracy through the mud, unquote. Rudd said those things on Twitter. Well, today, Kevin Rudd is the Australian ambassador to the United States, so he's deleted those tweets. But now reporters have found other similar statements he made. Back to you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Tom. The Cipher Brief is watching the U.S. transition very closely for the latest expert perspective on how the administration is shaping up to address both national and global security issues. Be sure to subscribe to the Cipher Brief. You can do that at thecipherbrief.com. Well, one of the many global challenges facing the president-elect is what to do in the Middle East, where Israel's war against Hamas and Hezbollah, both Iranian proxies, continues. The regional dynamics are complicated even further with the incoming administration, in part because U.S. officials have accused Tehran of trying to assassinate President-elect Trump for years. The order, according to U.S. officials, came after the killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in January of 2020 in Baghdad. Now, the Wall Street Journal is reporting that Tehran offered assurances to Washington just last month that it would not try to carry out an attack against the president-elect. But how might that backdrop further complicate an already difficult situation in the Middle East? And how might an end to the war impact dynamics in the region? We put those questions to the former National Intelligence Manager for Iran at ODNI, Norm Rule, who joined us from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to talk about it. Joining us now from Riyadh is Norm Rule. Norm, thanks so much for being here with the World Deciphered.
Hello, Suzanne. Thank you for having me.
I thought we might start off with really what's kind of trending in the news this week. There was a report that there were conversations between the White House and officials in Iran over what has been reported for years, which is Iranian plans to assassinate U.S. government officials who were associated with the order that actually ended up in the killing of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. I want to get your take on those reports, Norm. It had to be something of a tense and somewhat blunt discussion if it happened.
Yes, I read the report in the Wall Street Journal. It was quite an insightful and well-written piece. But let's unpack it a little bit to see what it says behind the words. So first, if the report is true, it tells you that the United States obtained intelligence or law enforcement information sufficiently credible to have the White House send a direct message to the Iranian government, apparently the Supreme Leader himself, warning them against a terrorist attack against a former president of the United States. Now, keep in mind, the Iranians often use criminals with explosives to conduct such terrorist events. So this would have been a threat not only against the president, but conceivably a threat against anyone else or many people at his campaign event. So if this had been executed, it would have been a catastrophic event with many casualties. The Iranians reportedly responded in writing with a short message stating that no such effort was underway, and they did raise the killing of Qasem Soleimani. So if this report is true, what this tells you is that deterrence is so low between the United States and Iran that Iran has gone from its threats against former Secretary of State Pompeo, former State Department official Brian Hook, and others, to threatening a former president of the United States, who might well become president of the United States itself. That's an extraordinary statement on the absence of deterrence. If the response had come from the Supreme Leader, it would have been long, religious, rambling. The Iranians know these responses are likely to leak to the press, which again, if this is true, it apparently did. So it's part of their propaganda campaign to demonstrate their reach. Again, what we're seeing is the Iranians didn't say they don't conduct terrorism, they will never conduct terrorism. They just said they're not conducting this particular batch of terrorism. It is an extraordinary statement on where Iran sees itself with the international community and the likelihood that terrorism by Iran, to include against the United States, will continue in the future.
Yeah, and the U.S. intelligence community has said otherwise, that these efforts have been underway. I thought we might shift now, Norm, to more of some of the regional, seismic shifts that we're seeing or may expect to continue to see in the future with a new U.S. administration. And I wonder if you could talk us through sort of the new security dynamic that you're seeing emerge, particularly because of Israel's war and its reach. What does this mean in the Middle East, do you think, for the U.S. moving forward?
Well, for the Trump administration, I think we've still got some basic framework principles. The United States does not wish to involve itself in a regional conflict. The United States will provide support to its partners to the extent that we feel appropriate to enable their defense against Iranian terrorism. The United States will maintain some military presence to support regional stability, but again, without involving itself in the conflict. For Israel, what this means that its new approach will likely involve the following blend: intelligence, which is meant to be actionable against adversaries to enable an extraordinary military strike to defang the strategic capability from these adversaries, and last, to recognize that it may be defended by the United States in part and others, but it fights on its own. And absence that fight, it will face a new Hezbollah, a new Hamas, Iranian threats, so it must take the offensive if it is to survive as a state. That is a tectonic shift. Within Iran itself, you have something very new. Iran has shown that it cannot defend itself against Israel. It has shown that it cannot stop attacks against Iran, last seen during the Iran-Iraq War. But we have also seen that the Israeli massive airstrike did not ignite a regional war. One could say that this might be a way by which some in the United States could think we ourselves could strike Iran on militarily if provoked by a kinetic attack or terrorist attack against the United States without fear of igniting a similar war. That's a very new place for us to be. The Gulf states, the other states, they're in a position where they don't wish to see a regional conflict, but they also wish to make sure that they're not part of any Iranian mischief. Last, China is irrelevant to this regional security dynamic. Russia is, as always, a malign and vindictive actor, and we have seen extraordinary snippets of reporting that Russia may be involved in providing weaponry to the Houthis and some kinetic support to Lebanese Hezbollah. That is a very new Middle East from anything we've seen in decades.
And we're seeing that build up really all around the world with this new alliance, particularly between China, Russia, Iran, and now North Korea. And I do wonder if you could talk just a little bit more, Norm, on the impact of that alliance in the Middle East. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I'd call it an alliance, but I would call it an ad hoc collection of activities to support each other's mutual strengths and benefits. We are watching a situation where soft power, where gray zone activity is being used by all of these actors, Russia, China, and Iran primarily, to exert power in their regions while eroding U.S. power. And I think what we've seen since 2014 is an absence of an international approach to respond to gray zone activity. Our national defense doctrines appropriately talk about great power struggle, China, Russia. That's all fine. But what happened in the Middle East in the last year and a half didn't involve massive great power involvement. What we're seeing with China against the Philippines, Russia in Africa, this isn't a traditional land war environment. Of course, Ukraine and Russia, that is a conventional conflict. But we don't seem to have a response for what we're seeing in the Middle East. And I think the Trump administration would be wise to consider how it will deal with such events in the future.
Yeah, the Cipher Brief's been focusing quite a bit as well, Norm, on gray zone activity, as it was one of the major themes of the Cipher Brief's threat conference recently. But that's also where CIA Director Bill Burns talked about the threat of really escalation of the war, particularly escalation between Israel and Iran. That was about a month ago. I wonder if you could kind of reassess that for us today, given that we're now living in a new environment post-election. Dynamics are changing, as you've already talked about. What do you see as the threat of escalation between Israel and Iran now?
When we think of a war, we traditionally think of a series of battles or activities. It's a very concrete temporal chain. The region is at war. It's just that the violence, the battles take place with a very different chronological layout. And the result is that we can stand back and say, as current Vice President Harris has stated, that we're not in a war environment, but we have aircraft carrier task forces catching dozens of missiles and drones. We have personnel in Iraq who have been attacked. We have Israel under attack. We have the Houthis firing missiles throughout the region. This is an extraordinary conflict. For Iran, however, it's a different challenge. Israel conducted an amazing strike that not only demonstrated its capacity to neuter Iran's air defense, but it demonstrated a knowledge of Iran's air defense and missile systems to conduct precision activities against very sensitive facilities. Iran needs to think not less how can it respond, but what does it do the day after when Israel comes in and, in essence, takes the conflict to the next level. So I see this conflict continuing. I just don't see it happening with an immediacy that some may have thought in this 24-hour news cycle zone. And I must praise Cipher Brief examination of this, because you haven't had that breathless approach to this new environment.
Thank you. We'll always take praise. Norm, I want to kind of shift gears for just a moment and talk about the close relationship between Benjamin Netanyahu and President-elect Trump. I think a lot of people are trying to guess right now whether that relationship may ever lead to a two-state solution. What do you think about the prospects of that being a possibility over the next 4 years? Well,
everything is a possibility, but that doesn't mean it's a probability. A two-state solution requires the following pieces, which both Benjamin Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas must accept. That's out of our hands. The Israelis, of course, must declare an end to hostilities, in major hostilities in Gaza, and withdraw their forces. An international peacekeeping force must come in. There must be demonstrated stability to allow the Palestinian Authority to establish, or some other similar organization, to establish good governance. You then need to have a reformed Palestinian Authority. ceasing such things as the pay for slay activities and others that many have rightfully complained about. And then you need to have an irreversible plan for a two-state solution that would encourage the Gulf states to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. In essence, we talk about this an awful lot as if we've got to do something or we need to pressure one of the partners or the other. In the end of the day, we can't want this more than they do. And that's probably one of the biggest things I've seen in following the Middle East and the West over the decades is people forget that the Palestinians themselves must undertake significant reforms so that the Palestinian Authority is effective, popular, not corrupt, capable, and the Israeli government will have to have some serious adjustments in its settler population and locations, and will have to accept a Palestinian state on its border, and the risk that a Hamas-like organization could in the future dominate that. Those are very complicated. Do I think it's possible that we could see this in coming months? I think a ceasefire in Lebanon and Gaza are probable in some way because Israel does want to pull its personnel out of these conflicts. But in the end of the day, the Lebanese and the Palestinians themselves, they've got to undertake reforms and take steps to make this achievable. Let's examine what would happen if they didn't. There are thousands of Palestinian gunmen left in Gaza. Do we want them to reform into Hamas 2.0 or Daesh? Yahya Sinwar's brother, who is worse than Yahya Sinwar, is still alive. Would we want that on the border of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Jordan? So we need to have some hard steps undertaken by all the parties involved. I do believe the Biden administration will continue to pursue this aggressively, both Gaza and Lebanon, in the remaining time. And the Trump administration will likely pursue this as well, both before, perhaps, and after they take office. One last point. Benjamin Netanyahu has incentives to end these conflicts. He's got to get his troops out of these countries. He's got to return these people to their jobs to restore their economic growth. And he's got to rebuild the national reputation of Israel in parts of the world.
We really appreciate you taking a few minutes to share some insight and put some context around these issues with us here at the World Deciphered. Thanks. It's nice to see you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you for the open source brief every morning. It starts my day and steers my day more often than you'd think. So all I can say is keep it up, work harder.
Well, thank you so much, Norm.
You probably already know that the Cipher Brief works with deeply experienced experts on global and national security to help put context around today's headlines. But did you also know that the Cipher Brief produces a daily report that keeps you up to speed on national and global security stories that are impacting businesses around the world? Like the President's Daily Brief, the Cipher Brief's open source report should be your first read of the day to stay ahead of the national and global security stories impacting your world. Become a subscriber and get the report for free. Subscribe at decipherbrief.com.
Another conflict that President-elect Trump has promised to address as one of his top priorities once he's back in the White House is Russia's war in Ukraine. The unprovoked invasion was launched by Moscow in February of 2020 and has involved Iran and North Korea, the U.S., Europe, and NATO. The Cipher Brief's chief international correspondent Ian Mermishvili spoke with the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, John Erbst, about how the incoming president may seek to negotiate peace in Ukraine and at what cost.
Ambassador Herbst, thank you very much for finding the time to talk to us, and welcome to the World Deciphered. Let's start from the topic that's in transatlantic relations is one of the biggest topics at the moment. Where do you see America's role in NATO moving forward, particularly given that the U.S. will have a new administration, President Trump's administration, at the White House?
There has not been much talk from the Trump campaign about NATO or from Trump himself. I mean, you did have one controversial statement by the candidate a few months ago about the concept of a two-tier NATO, right? Those who pay their way and those who don't. And the U.S. security commitment under Article 5 perhaps only applying to those who paid their way. I suspect that statement represents President Trump or President-elect Trump's ongoing frustration with NATO partners who are not paying 2%. And now I think there's large agreement that the floor for defense expenditure should be more than 2%, maybe 3%. And so I think that statement comes from such frustration. But of course, establishing such a two-tier NATO is nigh impossible. So I would interpret that statement as a encouragement for those laggards in NATO to increase their defense spending. And during the first Trump term, he would say some things that would raise questions about his commitment to NATO and about NATO's future. But the actual policy of his administration towards NATO was very similar to that of his predecessors and sound. And I have no reason to expect anything different this time.
Where do you think the new administration will stand on Ukraine's NATO membership?
Well, people in the Trump campaign have spoken negatively about Ukraine joining NATO. And some have said naively that, the fact that Ukraine was going to join NATO is why Russia invaded Ukraine, when we know Ukraine had no chance of joining NATO ever since the Bucharest summit in 2008, despite the language there. But in connection with Trump's peace ideas, we hear talk of a 20-year moratorium on Ukraine joining NATO, which means for 20 years it would not join, but does not rule out the possibility of eventually joining NATO. That's not ideal. Ultimately, Ukraine should be in NATO. The sooner, the better. But if a deal is reached, brokered by Trump, where you have European peacekeepers in between Russian and Ukrainian forces, if you have Ukraine receiving major armaments, that may well prove sufficient. That probably would prove sufficient to maintain Ukraine's security and its sovereignty. And while that's not ideal, especially for the Ukrainians who live under Russian occupation, because the Russians have been brutal to Ukrainians, it would still be a way to safeguard Ukraine and its future.
So, from the White House's perspective, it still comes back to the burden sharing.
I think, especially for Trump, yes, that's important. And Europe does have the means to do this. And while I believe that a Russian defeat in Ukraine is critical for the United States, it's also critical, and perhaps even more so, for Europe.
Would China be in any of the calculations for the new White House to deal with Russia?
It should be. I don't know if it will be. We do know that there is a group around Trump that appears to be clueless about the threat that Russia poses to United States interests. That seems to be clueless, does not acknowledge that Putin says, and other Russian officials say all the time, that the United States is adversary or enemy number one. They seem to be unaware or have decided it's not worthy of comment. That Russia conducted two major cyber attacks against the United States a few years ago that disrupted our petroleum supply system for part of the country and our food distribution system for part of the country. And of course, the threat to world shipping in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea is enabled by Iranian arms going to the Houthis and Russian arms going to the Houthis. And so for, again, short-sighted people, well, since China has a much larger and stronger economy, they are a greater threat. And in the long run, that's absolutely true. But they seem to not understand how China and Russia, and for that matter, Iran and North Korea, are working together against American interests, and how the best way to deal a blow to Xi and to make it less likely that he would strike at Taiwan is to ensure that Putin loses in Ukraine. That logic, which is eminently clear to people who think with a straight mind about the international picture, about dangers to American security, again, seems to be unknown amongst some portions of Trump world. But of course, there are others, and I think that the others include the Secretary of State designate Rubio and the incoming National Security Advisor Waltz understand the connection between China's danger threat to the United States and Russia's threat to the United States.
Do you think it's possible outside of NATO membership? Do you think it's possible to give Ukraine some sort of either just peace or sustainable peace with American
This is
guarantees?
this is very important. It's a great question, and I think the obvious solution to this question is Ukraine gets to join NATO. But if that's not going to be possible for 20 years, other solutions which have worked in the past include a bilateral security guarantee with the United States. They also include, in Korea, American troops on the ground, which has kept the peace with just some occasional clashes since the end of the Korean War. I sadly do not think that the current administration is thinking about this. I wish they were. I would encourage them to do so. They seem to be thinking about Europe as providing a peacekeeping force. And that could work as well, as long as there's very strong coordination and clear understanding with the United States about the type of support we would be providing from day one. That support would include intelligence. That support would include air defense of the European troops. And perhaps that support would include a clear and public understanding that if Russian troops, without provocation, struck European troops, the United States would help in any response to that provocation. Now, what I just described is also a tall order, but the stakes for any peace deal in Ukraine are extraordinarily high. There is no easy solution, and American critical interests are at stake. And the single most important reason for some optimism here is that Trump does not want to be seen as a weak figure, a patsy for Putin. And obviously, if he brokers a peace deal, which the Russians break, and he does nothing, or if he allows Russia to get away with rejecting his peace deal, and he does not make good his promise to arm Ukraine far beyond the way Biden armed Ukraine, then he would look weak.
Let's see how it goes. And this is my final question to you. Do you think there is anything that the Biden administration can do before January 20th to advance this and to make it easier, maybe, or set the stage up for Trump?
There's a lot it could do. It could, one, most immediately allow Ukraine to use ATACMS on targets in Russia. Two, the Biden administration, and this relates to both Ukraine and NATO, should be leading an effort in NATO to respond to regular Russian intrusions into NATO airspace. We should agree. We should take the lead in forging an agreement in NATO to shoot down the next Russian drone or missile that flies over NATO airspace. Three, there has been now 6 or 7 months of increasing Russian sabotage in NATO countries, including, if you believe the Wall Street Journal, an effort to plant bombs on planes heading to the US and Canada without any response. We should take the lead in NATO in responding to that. And finally, well, actually, not finally, fourth, the administration should work with like-minded members in Congress to try and get a supplemental aid package to Ukraine passed. And finally, I am pessimistic about all of these. The last one, I think there's no way of it happening, but it would be wonderful if it did. We, the United States, should give Ukraine Tomahawk missiles, which have a notably farther range than the ATACMS, and allow them to strike at strategic targets in Russia.
Yes, well, we'll see what happens in that direction as well. But I do appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
And that's it for this episode of The World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. Please remember, you can find a lot more expert interviews and insights on national and global security on the Cipher Brief's YouTube channel and also at decipherbrief.com. I hope you'll check it out and subscribe. I also encourage you to stay on top of what's happening Monday through Friday at decipherbrief.com, where you'll find our open source report, sort of like your own presidential daily brief, minus the classified stuff. I'm Suzanne Kelly. Once again, thanks for watching. We'll see you here next week on The World Deciphered.